All right, here we are. Bonjour, bienvenue tout le monde. Welcome online and in person to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you so much for joining us for Moving the Landscape to Find Ground, this series of talks and conversations, this time welcoming in Michèle Pearson Clarke, who you'll hear from shortly. Just before we get started, I wanted to help situate you by letting you know that we are streaming to YouTube live from fourth space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Nous reconnaissons la nation Kanien'kehá:ka comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. And we make this acknowledgement to bring awareness and understanding of the history of Indigenous peoples and their territories that we are currently occupying. So if you are new to fourth space, welcome. We're so pleased to be able to have you join us in person and online. What do we do here? Well, we work with our university community to help mobilize and exchange the knowledge that's being co-created across the university. And we do that through hosting a series of events on the daily, this being one of them today. It's really our great pleasure to welcome in the organizers for this event, as well as their special guest. So I'll pass it over to Hannah now, but before doing so, just the final note about engagement. If you're joining us online and you have questions and comments, feel free to raise a virtual hand and Diana will call upon you or read out what you might pop into the chat as a comment or reflection. And if you're joining us in the space, raise an actual hand and we'll get a microphone to you so that people online can hear your comments as well. So we'll go back and forth between online and in person if possible. Okay. That's it from me. Over to you, Hannah Klaus. Welcome.
Sego Sewagwego, Hannah Klaus Janjats. Greetings to you all. My name is Hannah Klaus. I'm a visual artist of Kanien'kehá:ka and English ancestries and member of Gantege, Tyndonega Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. I've been living here in Tiohtià:ke for over 20 years and am honored to be here on Kanien'kehá:ka territory. I was taught that Tiohtià:ke means where the people split, which we understand is the division of the people into two communities of Ganawage and Ganazadage. One of the older names for this place, Otsirikane, means around the fire, as a great fire would be built on the mountain, serving as a waiting place for visitors, travelers from across Turtle Island before being allowed into the village. The fires also served to communicate with other communities located further away on places that are now known as Mont Saint-Hilaire and Mount Sutton. So while there was division, there was also coming together. We continue in this tradition, and as co-director of Post Image, I'm very happy to welcome you to the 6th iteration of our year-long speaker series, Moving the Landscape to Find Ground. While I've got you here, I'd like to mention that the next artist on our list will be Kanien'kehá:ka visual artist and filmmaker Shelley Nero, with a film screening on March 28th at the DeSev Cinema, and an artist talk at the EV building on March 29th. Finally, before introducing our guest, I'd like to acknowledge the financial support of the Office of Vice President, Research and Graduate Studies, the Faculty of Fine Arts and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and our partners, Indigenous Faculty Research Center, the Black Perspectives Office, Milieu Institute, the Feminist Media Lab, and Daphne, Tiohtià:ke's Indigenous Artist-Led Center. I want to say Nyankoa, a big thank you to our intrepid team, Pedro Barbachano and Sierra Barber, and everyone here at Fourth Space. Thank you for hosting us. I also want to tip my proverbial hat to my friend and co-director, Deanna Bowen, who's joining us by Zoom and will be moderating the online conversations. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the artist Michèle Pearson Clarke, who is an artist, writer, and educator who works in photography, film, video, and installation. Using archival, performance, and process-oriented strategies, her work situates grief as a site of possibility for social engagement and political connection. Born in Trinidad and based in Toronto, her work has been included in exhibitions and screenings at the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal, Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, Royal Ontario Museum, Lagos Photo Festival, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, as well as many others. Most recently, Clarke was awarded the Toronto Friends for the Visual Arts 2019 Finalist Artist Prize and served as second photo laureate for the City of Toronto in 2019 to 2022. She holds a Master's of Social Work from the University of Toronto, and in 2015 received her MFA in Documentary Media from Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson, where she is an assistant professor in photography in the School of Image Arts. Michèle, thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to have to do this glasses on, glasses off thing because I'm middle-aged now. Thank you to Fourth Space for hosting our event. Thank you to Hannah and Diana for inviting me to come and share some of my work with all of you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And today, doing an artist talk is always an interesting process. And you've caught me at a sort of in-between place. There's some things, some new things I'm thinking about that are making me rethink some of my older work. So the version of my talk today is a bit experimental, and it's the first time I'm doing this version of the talk. So I hope that it makes sense and that you follow along with me, and happy to talk about any and everything at the end. So I start with this photograph. Grief is at the center of my practice, and I would say that over the past few years, I've really been interested in investigating the personal and political possibilities afforded by sharing experiences of longing and loss of people in my communities, so Black and queer longing and loss. And I start with this photograph because I think probably a lot of you work with vernacular photographs or family photographs, and it's the photograph that I return to again and again. My work is focused on grief because of my own grief experiences. My mom passed away in 2011 after a 14-year journey with cancer. And this photograph is the photograph that kind of grounds me and anchors me when that feels closer. And for some reason, coming to Montreal, which is the city where I was living when she was diagnosed with the cancer that took her life, has her on my mind. And so I start with this photograph as a way of bringing her into the room with me and with us. And also because there are other women that I want to bring in the room today as I talk. So let me follow now with this photograph. Is this photograph familiar? What are we looking at? We're looking at a portrait of Rosa Parks. And this is one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. And it's meant to document the events of December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, on the day that she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat at the front of a packed bus to a white man. And of course, a lot of us look at this photograph and we know that history, we know that historical event, and we see that historical event, we see that moment in this photograph. But there was no photographer on the bus that day. So this photograph was actually staged and taken over a year later on December 21st, 1956 by a photographer working for United Press International, the day after the United States Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery's segregated bus system was illegal. It shows Rosa Parks and a journalist named Nicholas Chris, who was just there that day for the story, and sort of photographer had him stand in as this ambiguous, amorphous white man. The photographer's name seems to be lost to time. We just know that it was a photographer working for United Press. So it has this tremendous significance as a type of historical evidence, as a type of historical truth, even though it's a staged photograph. And most people just accept it as fact. And reading about this photograph a few years ago, this is Fred Gray, who was a civil rights lawyer who represented Rosa Parks in court. And in a 2005 article in the New York Times, he said this: "It was staged, but I don't think it inaccurately represented anything. There have been so many misstatements and inaccuracies about the whole movement. To see something staged does not bother me at all." And there's two key parts in this statement that kind of sum up, I think, this in-between place that I find myself. the misstatements and inaccuracies in photography's history, and photography's representation, and photography's representation of queer people is something that all contemporary artists who work in this medium have to grapple with. He's talking here about, all of, not just representation, not just photography, but all of the ways that power and white supremacy distorts the truth of Black people's lives, of Black people's history, how things get repressed, how things get suppressed, how things get minimized, how things get reduced. But really what I loved is that he is so unbothered. And that emotional space of being unbothered is this space that I find myself trying to work towards in my practice right now. Let me bring Nicole Fleetwood into the room. This book, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, her 2011 text. I wish for all of the students in the room that you find your version of what this text is for me. This is the book that broke open my practice for me. This is the book where the ideas and the theory, the best theory is when you read something and you already know it to be true, and it resonates in your bones, and it becomes a tool that you can use in your work and in your life. And so I want to thank Nicole Fleetwood for her ideas and for this book. And I'll just read this summary. Troubling Vision addresses American culture's fixation on Black visibility, exploring how Blackness is persistently seen as a problem in public culture, and even in Black scholarship that challenges racist discourse. The questions that she's asking, working across visual theory and performance studies, are how is the Black body visualized as both familiar and disruptive? How might we investigate the Black body as a troubling presence to the scopic regimes that define it as such? How is value assessed based on visible Blackness? And these questions here on page 18 for me: who sees, how is seeing determined, when and where are the moments in which Blackness visually comes into being? These questions are deeply embedded in performance theory's inquiries into subjectivity, address, affect, and positionality. So this link between searching to see, given these misstatements, given these inaccuracies, how do we see Blackness in 2023? How do we see Blackness given this history that photography faces us with, right? What tools are available to us we can't free ourselves of that history, but we have to contend with it as artists. What strategies are available to us to best grapple with that? And for me, performance, I would say, is the #1 strategy for me at this stage. Let me bring Namwali Sopel into the room. This is a great read. I highly recommend it. And this was an essay that I just stumbled across during the pandemic in the Yale Review, where she's writing about what she terms the grace of Black nonchalance. And I'll just read her words. In the pantheon of Black feeling, nonchalance is not a god like righteous anger or crazy love, nor is it a minor deity like Sion Nai's racialized affects of irritation. The tendency to experience racial microaggressions as a pervasive dissatisfaction and animatedness, which treats Black people's bodies as malleable, manipulable, excitable objects. Black nonchalance doesn't react to racism, or rather, it performs non-reaction. It isn't unfeeling, it's unfazed. It isn't callous, it's cool. It registers and refuses at once. It declines in the sense that it withholds consent. What does the nonchalant person decline? She declines to be a puppet, to take on, channel, and express for others. She declines to be a tool, to resist, rail, and fight for others. She declines to be a sponge, to absorb all that this racist capitalist country pours out of its bloody, gaping maw. Black nonchalance is a form of grace. which is to say a way of seeing the long view, a way of surviving the eternal return of white supremacy, a way of making something out of that vast and terrible nothing. Let me bring Tina Post into the room. This is the newest of the new for me. Some of you may have heard her talk. She was hosted by your colleagues at McGill University last month here in Montreal. Her new book, Deadpan, The Aesthetics of Black in Expression. I'll confess, I haven't had time to read the book yet. I was just taking in her ideas in her talk. And this is a bit of a summary off of her website, where she describes the book as charting the interplay between Black performances of withholding and their interpolations by Black, white, and Asian interlocutors. Correcting the persistent cast of African American aesthetics as colorful, loud, humorous, and excessive, I assert that the performance of purposeful withholding plays a critical role in the work of Black culture makers throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. And I focus attention on when, how, and under what conditions artists find inexpression to be a useful tactic or desirable aesthetic approach. Deadpan, I find, is a malleable and capacious register, a surface quiet that marshals genre, material surroundings, and movement in order to affect its audience. And why do I find myself in this place of wanting to feel, express nonchalance, unbotheredness, deadpan? We grapple with this. It's because the work that I do is grappling with this archive, both the archive of photography. This whole series is about contending with these colonial histories. We know that photography was deployed to document the scientific fact of racial difference. We know that photography was used to justify slavery and then later racial segregation, to operate as some type of visual evidence of inferiority. Blackness, so photography has taught us to see Blackness in certain ways. It signifies and constructs a way of seeing Blackness that is still with us now, right? These are historical images that are not just in the past. They're activated and they continue to influence how contemporary images are made. And none of us are free, as I said, no matter what our race is, no matter where I grew up in Trinidad, this archive is so massive, this archive is so pervasive, it's everywhere. We're all exposed to it. Because my work is about grief and loss, I also grapple with the long history of making Black pain a spectacle for public consumption. As Deborah Walker King states in her comprehensive 2008 study, Black bodies have a history of being the most visible objects for pain's public consumption. In fact, the popular and recurring image of Black bodies in pain as a normalized representation of suffering in photos, film, and other cultural products has come to position these bodies as material representations of pain. This hypervisibility of our pain is sort of partly supported by what's known as the racial empathy gap. And that refers to the fact that white people think that Black people feel less pain than they do. We see this in, for example, medical studies where Black people receive less pain medication despite their reported levels of equal. We see it in bystander studies when we look at the likelihood of intervention when somebody is suffering, when somebody's in emotional pain. So what does it mean as a Black artist to produce images of Black pain given these archives and the way that they shape how we continue to perceive and understand and really limit and reduce the emotional interiority of Black people? And of course, a lot of these theories and a lot of this scholarship is produced, highly referenced in an African-American context. But as somebody who grew up in Trinidad and lives in Canada, it's clear that these ideas and these experiences don't stop at the border. So let me move now to one of my own photographs. Perhaps I look unbothered. I hope so. I'm going to start by looking at my most recent works and work backwards. As I said, I'm in this in-between place of shifting to try to find this space for myself in my practice. And the two projects I'll talk about first are my most recent attempts as I begin to move in this direction. Um, this is a photograph from a project called The Animal Seems to Be Moving. Some of you may have seen some of these images at Center Clarke. Thank you to Center Clarke for hosting this project last fall. Joanna Yakim wrote a beautiful essay. She's here today. Thank you so much. So this project is about the intersection of my Blackness, my masculinity, my queerness, and my aging. So I always say to the room, you know, I definitely give a prize to anybody who can guess my age, but I've always been read as younger than I am. And that's been a good thing and a bad thing in many ways. But I had this moment in early 2018 where I was brushing my teeth, very banal morning, and I looked in the mirror, and maybe some of you can relate to having that moment where you suddenly are foreign to your own self. And I looked in the mirror and I thought, oh, your face is changing. And I thought, oh, is your body finally catching up to how old you actually are? So I kind of had a chuckle about that. And then it's pretty common for me to have experiences in public space that involve some kind of hostility in my direction. I'm often read as a man, I'm often read as a Black man, particularly in, you know, single-sex gendered spaces that can be provocative for some people. But after I had this moment of looking in the mirror, the following months I found that, I don't know, I had like 2 or 3 particularly very drastically hostile encounters in public space. And I sort of thought, it felt like things were ramping up, you know? And I was like, what is this? Like, what is this now? And I thought back to that moment eventually, and I thought, oh, is it because this thing I'm seeing in myself that I'm changing, is that mean people are seeing me differently? And this is provoking a greater level of hostility. And obviously I don't know for sure, but I thought to myself, am I moving from being read as a Black boy to being read as a middle-aged Black man? And even though we know Black children have their innocence robbed, we also know that for most people, a man is more threatening than a boy. And as I was kind of reflecting and rolling around these ideas, you know, at first I was annoyed to think that this possibly could be going on. And then I got to this place of feeling like, this is absurd. This is absurd that I have to worry about this. This is absurd that on top of all the other things that we all have to deal with as we get older, my knees hurt, my hangovers last a week now. Yes, it's gonna come for all of you too. But I just thought it's absurd that I have to worry about possibly more risk and less safety for myself in the world just because I'm aging. And when I came to that emotional place, I was really struck by this feeling of this is absurd as a response to a form of oppression, you know? And I think it's using humor, using comedy, being able to laugh at difficult things as a coping strategy that we all use to deal with some of the harder things in life. And I was really interested to think about using that framework of absurdity to explore this issue that really is fraught with a lot of grief, a lot of anxiety, a lot of anger, and a lot of pain. It also felt, as I was started to think about moving into this work, that it was in some ways a kind of like, oh, well, I've gotten away with a lot by being read as younger than I am. So there was also this kind of saying goodbye to my queer boyhood that I wanted to kind of weave into the project. And many of the scenarios that are depicted in these self-portraits, this is my first time working in self-portraiture, and many of these ideas, many of these images are kind of rooted, I would say, in some of my earlier memories as a kid. So, I don't identify as a man, but I've been masculine my whole life. And certainly when I was a little kid, I did want to be a man. I wanted to, and you, as a kid, you kind of project ahead to yourself as an adult, or you have these things that, when you're a kid, you always want to be older than you are. You always want to be, and you try to inhabit adultness in different ways. You try things on, you fashion things for yourself so the world will treat you as older than you are. And these are some of the memories, these are some of the things that I worked into this project as I was sort of playing with this idea of just asking people to consider their perceptions and ideas of somebody who, you know, holds the intersectional identity that I do. And it's intentionally a photographic project. I actually work more in video than I do photography, but I would say that I make video like a photographer, I think like a photographer. And this project is intentionally photographic because, you know, I don't want people staring at me when I'm walking down the street, but this is an invitation to really look. You know, with a video, the video moves all the time. It's a limited gaze. The photograph, you invite, you give permission, right, for a durational gaze with a photograph. And that was an intentional choice with this project. And it's not, it's a performance with the camera, but it's not a dress up. You know, it's not a Cindy Sherman type of gesture that I'm trying to make here. I'm wearing all my own clothes. You know, I am just choosing very banal locations. Most of it is, they're all shot outside because this is an experience of an encounter. This is an experience of what happens when people see me in public space, right? This is not something that I experience. When I'm in my house, I'm just me. I'm only these things when I leave the house and encounter other people's perceptions. Some of you may recognize, this one is the newest one I made, and it's also a hat tip to the work of Susie Lake, who explores, you know, femininity in this project, Beauty at a Proper Distance. And when I started this project, I only thought about it as a photographic project. And I've only shot one, this is a 16 millimeter, this is one reel of 16 millimeter film. And this was, again, an experiment, thinking about working towards a solo show with these photographs and thinking about the relationship in my practice between the still and the moving, thinking about the photograph as I just said, as an invitation for durational gaze, and thinking about the durational gaze of the still video or still film portrait. And I finally had a chance to show this at the Center Clarke exhibition. And again, these things are experiments, right? It's like, you're like, how is it gonna operate in relationship to the photographs? And I was grateful to have the chance to see what it did to the photographs. And I would love to hear from anybody who saw the show, what that did for them. And when I started this project, it grew out of this body of work, A Welcome Weight on My Body. This is an exhibition I had at Gallery 44 in Toronto in 2018. And this project came about, I was invited to be, they have a year-long artist residency. I was invited to be artist in residence from 2016 to 2017. And I was in, you know, I had finished school in 2015 and I was thinking about work that I wanted to be making, but I was looking at a lot of work. I was going to galleries all the time. And I was really struck by the fact that almost all of the work by other Black artists that I felt were true to me, images where I felt I was looking and seeing Blackness the way that I know it to be true, almost all of those photographs were shot on film. So work by Dina Lawson, for example, work by Dawood Bey, work by Latoya Ruby Frazier. These are all artists shooting on film. And I thought, you know, like, that can't be a coincidence, right? Like I know there's been a resurgence and more people are shooting on film, but these are artists who have consistently shot on film throughout their practice. And so I spent this residency doing some research and thinking and holding conversations with other artists to try to sort of, you know, arrive at making sense of this coincidence that I was experiencing. And the title of this project comes from a way of trying to describe what it feels like to look at one of these photographs where you see Blackness in the way that you know it to be true. And does anybody here have a weighted blanket? it's that kind of concept, right? It's like, it's this welcome weight on your body for me that I feel in the gallery. There's like this weight of seeing, this comfort from the weight that's placed on my body from viewing one of these photographs. And in the end, so with this project, the self portraits were part of this larger body of work, which really involved me photographing folks in Toronto who volunteered. I was learning to shoot medium format, so I went back to school later in life. I didn't do a BFA. I didn't have a chance to learn some photographic techniques early in life, and I got a grant for a mentorship. And I worked with Brendan George Coe, who some of you might know. So Brendan was my mentor, and I had been gifted a Hasselblad, and I was learning to shoot with the Hasselblad. And so I just asked anybody who was willing to sit for a portrait for somebody who was learning. And the exhibition tries to make that learning the site of inquiry. I think, as an older artist, one of the things I grapple with is people's ideas and expectations. We have kind of linear narrative of success in our culture that defines all types of arcs, including the path of an artist. And I wanted to make the process of learning something transparent and open, as opposed to, I think there's a lot of things we hide. I think photography as a system hides a lot of things. There's gatekeeping in every system, and gatekeeping usually serves power best. And so I wanted to sort of explore that in this project. But also theoretically, the research that I had done in the residency, I was really building on the ideas of Tina Kampt. Some of you were probably at her talk right here recently, and her book, Listening to Images, 2017, where she talks about listening to images as a practice of looking beyond what we see and attuning our senses to the other affective frequencies through which photographs register. It is a haptic encounter that foregrounds the frequencies of images and how they move, touch, and connect us to the event of the photo. And so, building on this research in the residency, I theorized that if a photograph's frequencies are a potential route to a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge generated by feeling, then perhaps the rough texture, or what Kampt herself refers to as the thinginess of an analog photograph of blackness, produces an intensity of vibrations to which we can more easily attune. So I wanted to learn medium format photography. I wanted to shoot in film to bring forth this quality that I was theorizing was present, this sort of relationship between the analog photograph and the visuality of blackness, through this prism of Tina Kampt's ideas of the frequencies produced by a photograph. Because surely a digital photograph, which is a smooth, clean thing, would produce different frequencies than an analog photograph, which is literally a gritty thing. There's a kind of maximalist approach to installation, as you can see here, which was also just kind of really fun. There's a lot of ideas about how photography should be displayed in the gallery that are themselves Eurocentric. And so I was really interested in just deviating from that as much as possible. And this, preoccupation with frequencies that I share with Tina Kampt extends very much into, I would say, a general preoccupation with sound in my moving image work. Before I went back to school to do my MFA, I worked in health communications for a decade. So I'm a talker, I'm a writer, and my work tends to either be full of language or absent of language. Quantum Choir is the most recent work I've made. I just got back from Winnipeg, where it opened at Plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art. It's there until June. Quantum Choir is a 4-channel video installation that reflects on the vulnerability of learning to sing as a way of exploring the legibility, precarity, and affinity of contemporary queer female masculinity. So for this piece, I worked with 3 other queer masculine women to overcome our collective shame around our bad singing voices and to sing publicly for the first time. This is the work installed at the Art Gallery Hamilton, where it premiered last summer. And since my practice always focuses on the grief experiences of my communities, my work always involves asking for a great deal of vulnerability from my participants. And at times it's become clear that I have asked for too much with these projects. So I've had projects either fall apart, or I had to completely change what I was doing because what I was asking the community to do, nobody wanted to do. So I've come to understand that I am not a good judge of vulnerability because for whatever reason, I seem fairly comfortable. Like I've never asked people to do something that I wouldn't do, but clearly what I would do is like up here at some end of a spectrum, and people are like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. So in trying to unpack these moments of creative failure, I was interested in taking a self-reflexive approach to this feeling of too much. When it comes to vulnerability, I was like, well, how do I introduce more opacity and refusal into my work? How do I continue to make the work that I feel, compelled to make, but find a way to allow people to participate, right? And in this moment of searching for more opacity to figure out how to bring that into my practice, I did feel like I wanted to kind of explore my own line in the sand. I wanted to think about what would be the thing that if another artist was like, would you do this? I would be like, yeah, hell no, I'm not doing that. And given my lifelong shame over my terrible singing voice, it took about a nanosecond to figure out that it should involve singing. I know like a lot of people are bad, like when I talk about this project, people are like, yeah, I go to karaoke, like whatever, like you sound terrible, it's not a problem. And everybody in this room knows that shame is not an objective experience, shame is a subjective experience. So I really have avoided singing publicly my entire life. I've never done karaoke. I lip sync the anthem at sporting events. I like pretend to sing happy birthday at friends' dinner parties. I love to sing by myself, and even in front of my partner, it doesn't really happen. And while there are many other things that I'm bad at, I want to note that my shame at this particular failure is linked to other social failures that I've experienced. We know that culturally certain voices are valued and devalued based on markers of social difference, including race, gender, and sexuality. But for me, it really is deeply connected to, I don't know why this keeps jumping ahead, sorry. Especially my gender. I grew up in Trinidad. I went to an all-girls school, and getting into choir was like really the cool girl thing to do in 1980s Trinidad. And I couldn't sing, so I couldn't get into choir. And so there's this kind of early memory of really kind of feeling at girlhood in many ways, but particularly this expectation and desire to be able to join this very beautiful communal, experience. So thinking alongside queer theorists rather than resisting these failures or seeing them as deficits, I was really interested in embracing them, both to acknowledge the grief that exists within them and to explore what might be collectively generated from them. So with Quantum Choir, I was particularly interested in what might be generated by exploring the current griefs and longings present in queer female masculine identity. Recent shifts in larger cultural conversations have brought new pressures to bear on masculine gender identities, but also new frictions, I would say, within queer communities as our masculinities continue to evolve and diversify. Despite the recent, all the social gains we've made as queer folks, it still feels tricky to discuss the vulnerability inherent to queer female masculinity. And I was really interested in utilizing the affective qualities of singing to navigate what is, for me, a complex mix of privilege, oppression, power, and invisibility. Here you can see the final installation, as I said, which made its debut at the AGH. There are 4 vertical monitors mounted on these specially designed steel frames. Each monitor has its own separate soundtrack. The video and audio are synced, and the entire work is just under 13 minutes. You're probably wondering what is up with those footballs. The other thing I was thinking about with this work was, this is the 5th or 6th video work that I've made. And because all of my work is about grief, because all of my work is about this vulnerability in Black queer folks, one of the things I had been grappling with was the power dynamic of the gallery. Most video is projected on the wall, there's a bench, you kind of walk in, you sit, and you kind of consume this imagery, right? There's a kind of passive consumption of what the artist is offering. And I just was trying to think of, how do I begin to ask for a more active engagement from the spectator and disrupt that dynamic? Again, going back to what I had said about, I really don't want my experiences, our experiences, to be a spectacle for consumption, right? So I knew that I wanted to create some sort of, not necessarily a barrier, but some sort of way of making the spectator immediately aware of their own body and asking them to make certain choices. And so this grid, when you come into the gallery, you have to, it's not a lot of work to walk through them, but you do have to pay attention to where you're walking and make your choices about where you walk. And then when you get to the installation, you can't look at all four of us at the same time. You're surrounded by us and you have to constantly choose where you stand and who you're looking at for how long and who you're listening to, right? Because we each have our own sound source. During the piece, the first half, I hired a vocal coach. We worked with Teya Kasahara, who's a trained opera singer. I chose this song, Queen of Denmark by John Grant. And so the first 8 minutes of the piece is us just doing the vocal warm-ups, communicating hopefully just through these sounds, right? For anybody who's done scales, it's a lot of wheeze and woes and e's and moos and mahs. And then we sing and then the last 5 minutes is us singing the song. So I'll just play a couple clips. Sound is not working. Yeah. Yeah. I can just skip the parts with sound. Yeah. Sorry about that. You'll have to imagine us singing. Yeah. Sorry, just get back on track. Yeah, I do have a number of clips that I won't be able to share, so I'll just speak about them. So Quantum Choir builds on strategies that I used in this 3-channel work, Suck Teeth Compositions, after Rashad Newsom. This is a work I made in 2018. And then with this work, I was really thinking about the ways that when Black Canadians speak up about experiences of anti-Black racism, very often people's experiences are minimized or reduced because of a comparison is made with the US. So we may hear, well, really that happens here? I thought that just happened there. Or, okay, it happens here, but it's not as bad as there. Like our experiences can't just be allowed to be, it's always sort of in conversation, in parallel, in relation to what happens in the US. And I was also thinking about this continual sort of surprise that's often expressed by white Canadians, no matter how many times these stories are told, no matter how many times things happen in the newspaper, there's still this renewal of like, really? And I was thinking about what supports that surprise. And sometimes for anybody in this room who's spoken up against oppression, we know that when you speak up against oppression, very often you become targeted, right? You become a problem because you're making people uncomfortable, before you're rocking the boat, so on and so on. So I was thinking about this way that as a coping strategy, we speak up when we can, but we don't always speak up. We don't always express the anger and frustration and fear that we feel. And I wanted to think of a way to sort of allow for a collective, because I think one of the things that a collective expression does, it makes it more difficult to reduce to also are you sure you're not like, you'll speak up and somebody will say, well, I'm sorry you feel that way, and is it sort of you? So this work, I invited 17 Black Torontonians to join me to make this piece, which is basically a 10-minute piece of people doing that. It's a challenge to, we know that Blackness is not a monolith, but I particularly think in a Canadian context, our histories are so diverse. Some of us have been here for 5 centuries, some of us just came, we come from all over the world. There's a lot of things that overlap. There's not a lot of things that we all share, but almost all of us make that sound. It's a sound that traveled across the Atlantic, and is a sound that also hasn't changed in 500 years. It's still expressed similarly in our countries of origin. And the work is in conversation with the African-American artist, Rashad Newsom. Because of this comparison that I'm talking about, I really wanted to sort of highlight and foreground that. And it's a response to a well-known work by Rashad called Shade Compositions, where he conducts a live choir of women of color, queer men of color, making a variety of oral gestures. And he has this really amazing sound equipment that he uses. And so he gets invited to do it somewhere. He casts from a local community, and his audition tapes are shot in this way with just a plain white background. So it visually references his audition tapes. But he conducts a live performance, and he's recording the sound as people are making it and playing back. So there's this layer of sound that's happening and him playing it back. And so similarly, I use pacing, rhythm, and repetition to create this kind of just, expression that is absent of language. I think, one of because my work is really focused on, as I keep saying, on grief and emotion. At least in Western culture, we will often say things like, I couldn't find the words, I didn't know what to say, right? When it comes to emotional experience, language hits a certain point where it doesn't do what we need it to do. And so rather than interviewing folks and asking them to share their stories and share their experience, I ask them to just, express their interiority just using this gesture. And it's a huge vocabulary for anybody who's familiar with it or uses it in their daily life. It really ranges from, irritation, disgust, anger. And so some of them are short, some of them are long, but collectively it's this 10-minute piece of just that sound. And I'll skip that clip. In contrast to that, my MFA thesis, Parade of Champions, which I made in 2015, this is the first time I used a durational portrait. And this is really, for me, the piece that really lives between video and photography. There were a lot of things that surprised me about after my mom passed away, but one of the things that really surprised me is that I felt more vulnerable to racism, and I felt more vulnerable to homophobia after she passed. And I was really interested in thinking about this relationship between the connection to a mother and then this sort of buffer from oppression. And with this piece, I worked with 3 other Black, queer, and trans folks who had lost their mom around the same time that I did. So we'd all been grieving for about the same length of time. I wanted to think about asking the viewer to sit in the gallery and serve as a witness to a grief experience that I really, couldn't find. In my own grief, I was turning to culture, right? I was looking for sources, and almost everything that has been written about, or mainstream narratives about queer grief focus on HIV and AIDS, and mainstream narratives that focus on Black grief, when they do, rooted in violence, homicide, police violence, not just this sort of everyday universal experience of grieving a mother. And also I was thinking about the kind of narrow ideas we have about how Black people are more homophobic than everybody else, and that when people come out, they automatically get rejected from their families. And not that that's not the experience of a lot of people, but it's a single story, right? It's many of us have complex relationships, but do have love and acceptance from our families. And certainly that was what all 4 of us had. And so it's when you sit in the gallery, you're sitting looking at 3 people who are just sitting looking at you. It's an audio documentary that you're listening to. I asked each of the participants to speak about their relationship with their mom, what it was like when she passed away, and in what ways their Blackness and or queerness had shaped their experience of grief and mourning. And then this work, this is the first time I used repetition and utterance in a work. And this is a piece that was a way of thinking about or sharing what one of the other things I experienced with grieving my mom was that I didn't understand that I knew I would grieve for me, but I didn't understand I would also grieve for her. So, you know, there's things that she will never get to experience, and I grieve her loss as well as my loss. And I use speech as a way of kind of reflecting on this dual nature, because I think one of the ways that, you know, we connect and share with each other is through the stories that we tell, the opinions that we share. And so I think of all the stories and opinions that I'll never get to hear from my mom, but it's all the stories and opinions that she will never get to share as a way of, you know, contributing to the world in the ways that we do in those ways. And so I use Audre Lorde here as a surrogate and a stand-in, because similarly, you know, Audre Lorde's intellectual, her thinking, her writing helped me make sense of myself. And I wonder, what would Audre Lorde have to say about climate change? You know, what would Audre Lorde have to say about late stage capitalism that might help us make sense of it? So this is an ongoing loss. And I use Audre Lorde also because she also lived with cancer for 14 years, which was the same for with my mom. I won't play that. And I'll just end with a note on what the work that I'm working on now, in which I'm really trying to be as unbothered as possible as I make my way through this piece. And this is one of the projects that I talked about, you know, asking for too much from the community. This is a project that has been through many iterations, because the first version, nobody wanted to do. The second version, nobody wanted to do. And so I've arrived at this last and final version. So this is a piece, part of you know, healing from losing my mom was kind of reorienting myself towards my dad and doing some work around healing my relationship with him. And one of the things we did is I went to Trinidad. This is his home. I went to Trinidad, and I was starting to think about, I'm very much like my mom, but I really started to understand the ways that I'm also like him. And even though I'm not a man, it became really apparent that my masculinity, the embodiment of my masculinity, is very shaped by the type of man that he is. So I was really interested in thinking about the transmission of masculinity between him and me, you know, the inheritance of masculinity, not from a father, not from a son inheriting from a father, but a daughter inheriting from a father. And so we had a conversation about masculinity. And right at the end of the conversation, I took this portrait of the two of us. And so the original plan was for it to be a photographic project where I invited other women to have that conversation with their own dads, but nobody wanted to do it. So at this stage, I'll just say I'm writing a script that is containing, you know, some of the script is based on the conversation I had with my own dad. Some of it is based on conversations other people had with their dads. Some of it's not going to be a hybrid fiction documentary work. It's going to be a 2-channel video installation. I'm going to hire an actor to play the dad. I'm going to play the daughter. And we will speak to each other across the gallery. And so these ideas that I started with of being unbothered, you know, I mean, I think we look pretty deadpan there. So I think I'm on my way. But I just want to leave you with this photograph. I started with a photograph of my mother and I. I'm going to end with a photograph of my dad and I. And thank you so much for listening.
I can hear the fire engine going by.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michèle, for your talk. I can't see the floor, so just let me know, y'all, if there's anybody out there that has a question. I think Pedro is going to be roaming the room with a microphone to help anybody out. And if you are online, by all means, raise your hand digitally if you could, and let me know whether or not you have a question, or post something in the chat. Yep. Not yet. Okay. Oh, hey, Pauline, how you doing?
Good, thank you. Oh, turning on my camera. Hi.
Yep. Hi. What's your question?
Yes, it's about the project you talked about, like with everything you said, and asking too much from the community and how we experience vulnerability. I was wondering, like you said a little bit about like how the project changed, because I remember hearing about the project about father and daughter a few years ago, and I've been like looking like, when is it coming up? When is it coming up? And and I was like, that's a tough project to create this image of us, like what it asks from us, and yeah, I was wondering like, through your work and your relation to the communities and the family, like how do you see it coming, and how do you see it like for the project in the future when you want to work with communities and vulnerability that way?
Well, that project is exactly the arc of starting with, doing it myself, inviting other people to do it. And part of, just so everybody knows, I always build a project website. So I say, this is who I am, this is what I'm making, this is why I'm making it, this is where it's going to show. So what that allowed me with this project is it allowed a lot of people to, like, there's vulnerability in that because people know what I'm going to make before I actually make it. But I get a lot of debate and dialogue and conversation from that. Mm-hmm. So I had people saying, wow, like, I couldn't ask my dad to do that. And I think in general, as an adult, to sit down and talk to your parent about anything, I think, is a big ask for a lot of people, and far less to talk about something, that might have a hard conversation. But what it did do is people were like, I don't want to do it, can't wait to see it, the same way you're telling me now, like, when is it coming out? So that desire and expression of, this is meaningful to me, I want to see this, made me realize, okay, well, I have to hold on to this, because as artists, we know not everything is a good idea, right? So instead of letting it go, I kind of stayed with it to try to figure out what form can it take that will be meaningful to me, interesting to me, and hopefully interesting to other people. Mm-hmm. And so it did start a process with a few people who wanted to have the conversation but didn't want to be in a photograph. So I have these conversations from people who were willing to share that audio with me, because I recorded the conversation I had with my dad as well. So now I have these conversations, but then what happened is they started with the questions I gave them, but then all those other conversations go off in all kinds of directions, because I think those fathers and daughters use that opportunity of sitting down with each other to talk about the thing that they actually really needed to talk about, which is great. But then I was like, oh, I don't have enough in these conversations to write a script. And then, it's interesting how we sometimes struggle to give ourselves permission to do things. And even though I love hybrid documentary and show it in my classes all the time, I had never made a hybrid documentary. So it took me a long time to be like, oh, wait a minute, I can write some of this script. So that's the version now. So these women are invisible in the script. You don't know who said what. You don't know what is the part I inserted or not, or drew from other sources. The actor plays the collective dad, I play the collective daughter. So people were able to participate, but not be visible, but be personally visible in the project. So that's the strategy I arrived at, and that's what I'm working on now.
Okay, thank you. I think it's like interesting, because when the project circulated, it's not a question what I'm saying, but it's a comment. it raised a lot of discussion in my friends and communities, and people started to be like, okay, can I try to contact my dad? But we never come to the point where we arrived to do it. And it made me think like, oh, the work is already starting, even if it's invisible just by starting the project. And there was a lot of discussion, but like, oh, I'm gonna bring my dad to that exhibition as a way to counter what we couldn't do directly. But yeah, thank you for the work you do. It's really, really interesting and important. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because that's something I didn't understand until the first project I did this way was in 2013. And it's a project called It's Good to Be Needed, where I invited queer women who were exes but not friends to meet and hold hands. And again, I knew that was I knew that one was hard. But again, I wanted to do it with my ex-wife, but she didn't want to do it. Because we know, if you're familiar with queer culture, we know that it's common for queer women to be friends with their exes. I had been through this marriage, I had been through this divorce very early on, and was feeling a huge amount of sense of failure. Our community finally won this legal right, we get married, and then we get divorced, and so I was kind of thinking through that, and I was thinking about, the lack of ritual we have as adults, and the way that most queer women, like, we use language, we use conversation, we do, we all know lesbian processing, right? So we try to be friends, and we get to a point where we can't be. So not only has the relationship failed, but we failed this community norm of like being friends with each other. And so the project was an invitation to see, could meeting to hold hands, could a physical gesture do what language couldn't do? Could that allow for shifting some of the pain, hurt, shame that prevented the friendship from forming? So it's not saying everybody should be friends, and sometimes people draw good, healthy boundaries for good reasons, but most of us, it's just hard, right? And it's because there's still love there.
Yeah.
And that project, I built a website, I sent it out into the world. And wow, it was really fascinating, because there's only 4 photographs in that series, including 2 here in Montreal. But everywhere I went for like the 6 to 9 months I worked on that project, women would come up to me and say, I'm sorry, I can't be in the project, or, I know which ex, like people, like everybody participated in their head. So the same way you're telling me now, like you and your friends were talking about, can I talk to my dad? Like everybody was talking about it, and like, it would be this ex, and how would it go, and where would you shoot it? So it's really interesting to me that this public way of working, it wasn't a plan, but it's become part of how I work, because I realized that, it's as you said, the project is working in all of these other ways, and the 4 photographs are just a small part of what was made by the project. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I have like 7 million questions, including one follow-up to your beautiful discussion about the father-daughter project. So I guess I'll lead with that one, and then I have a question about Glitter Stash. So you briefly mentioned participants feeling more comfortable through the format of hybrid documentary, and how this afforded them a level of anonymity, or like a foil of opacity. And I'm wondering about how that impacts you as the artist, because then you're kind of putting yourself on the screen as the shield to provide that opacity to your participants. So I'm really curious about sort of that piece and how that works for you, because you also had the conversation with your own father. So I'm curious about that piece. And then, do you want me to go straight into Glitter Stash?
No, I'll just say quickly, I didn't say to participants, I'm going to make a hybrid documentary. Like this is a strategy I arrived at just as an artistic choice. So these 4 conversations happened a long time ago, where these were people who didn't want to be in a photograph, but wanted to have the conversation. I didn't know where things were going, and I was like, okay, great, have the conversation, record it, share whatever of that you're comfortable with, and I'm gonna figure out what I'm gonna do. So it took a long time of figuring out after listening to what they shared with me, I was like, what do I do with this? I can't write a script from what I have, and so I've never written a script before. I haven't worked in this way before. So I think it just took a while to arrive at like, oh, I can do this, And also sometimes, things take a long time, and every other work you keep living, you keep looking at work, and then you're like, oh, right, and you get ideas from what other artists have done, and like other, reading something completely unrelated, and it feeds in. And also just thinking about, you learn from every work, the way my work has been received, the ways that Blackness is foregrounded no matter what for like a lot of viewers. And really, I think too, I had a conversation with Lou Shepard for C Magazine last year, and we both, I think, realized too that part of the rigor and the choices we've made is feeling like we don't have the luxury to be esoteric. We don't have the privilege of being opaque to a certain, that we need to be legible, and we need to make our work legible and translate our work for everybody else. And now that, I've shown a little bit, people have a sense of my practice. I think in Quantum Choir and The Animal Seems to Be Moving, that sense of play and experimenting and trying things and not being 100% sure why I'm exactly making this creative decision, but just it's a more instinctual thing, that all of that now is working its way into my approach to the shortest distance between two people, including doing a script, including drawing from multiple sources, both as a way of just pushing, for me, creatively forward, but also introducing this opacity for my participants. I don't feel that need for opacity because, as we've already established, I'm very comfortable with vulnerability. But acting across an actor, I can't wait for that. I think it's gonna be hilarious. I think it's gonna be funny. And I wanna play with that because the actor's gonna be really good at acting and I'm gonna be really bad at acting. And I'm really interested in that juxtaposition in the work itself.
Thank you for that. I'm very excited to see this work when it's ready. My second question had to do with Glitter Stash. Earlier you mentioned that in your work sometimes you see photo as an invitation to really look, right? An invitation for a durational gaze. And I'm wondering how that translates into Glitter Stash, the video, the film, because that durational gaze is there, but it's somehow different in this space. And it's different for the viewer, obviously, because there's a more active gaze that's returned, right? And I'm wondering what it is that you hoped it would do and how that differs for you from the still photo, because we have, or at least at Clarke, there were both.
I originally wanted to go in that direction because I was thinking about this relationship of the medium format or any film photograph, right? What I was talking about with what I call affective grit, this relationship between the analog medium and the visuality of Blackness. And with this project, I was like, oh, well, the very first thing I made was Super 8 transferred to video. And so I thought about 16mm in relationship to this project. And because I'm always working between the photographic and the video and this relationship between the still and the moving, but I had done still video portraits. I had done still video portraits for Parade of Champions. So it was an experiment, just went out with a friend, rented equipment. I went out with a friend and just shot this one roll of 16. And I wasn't sure if I was going to exhibit it. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. Ended up, shooting the photographic version of Glitter Stash. Like I actually shot the film version first and went back and shot the photographic because I wasn't sure that the film had a place. And when I've shown the photographs before, they've been in a group exhibition and it didn't work. But then when Santa Clarke gave me, had this invitation, I thought, oh, it made me go back to that experiment and be like, does this have a place in this body of work? And I also, for me, the gallery is a site of research, and so I was like, well, I'm gonna try it and see how people, I don't know. And this is what I mean about the new permission I'm giving myself to just let's see. Maybe it will work, maybe it won't, but you trying to communicate something. I'm always trying to communicate something with my work. And the only way to know if that's happening is to show it and see what people are receiving or not. And for me, in conversations I had with people that night, it's weird how the one moving image animates all of the still images in the room. They're still, but now they're moving. I don't know. Yeah. It's kind of fun. I'm still trying to figure it out.
Thank you.
Thank you. I need a microphone over here.
Diana, are there online questions?
I have a question. My hand's up. So, would you prefer to go with the person in the room, or can I go?
We'll do one online and one in person.
Lovely. Okay. Who's up? Me? Me. It's me.
It's you.
Um, Hi, Michelle. So, I just wanted to pick up on this idea or the potential of working with actors and thinking about um, whether or not you see this as an opportunity to work to kind of have more theatrical license in the work that you're producing. So um, that kind of challenge of working with others, still moving image or photography. There's something else that's in here, which is this live performance and what that kind of energy and degree of vulnerability I'm interested in that vulnerability and curious about whether or not you would consider doing live performance.
I never had considered it, and because I've been working on this project for so long, I talked to a lot of people about it, and I participated in a residency. And one of the studio visits that I had, he assumed it was live performance the whole time I was talking about the project. He thought it was like a live performance, and I thought, oh no, I'm not, And for me, I don't know that I have the. Oops, sorry. I don't know that I have the. Confidence around learning lines and performing to that degree for myself. I can see potentially down the road directing live performance with just actors, but for this work that I'm putting myself into, and I think part of the self-portraits and part of putting myself in here is I'm still figuring out the opacity piece, right? I'm still trying to figure out how to bring other people in, and in the meantime, it's me. So I am very drawn to live performance. I'm very drawn to what that produces, and the ephemerality of that moment. And the chaos sometimes of how things go, because with video, and I actually try to build that a little bit into how I edit as well. I try to include some of the moments that went a little bit off, but I'm really going in not knowing a lot and really looking forward to figuring out this process and learning from working with and I need to find an actor who's really kind of game for being a creative contributor to the project as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So I was curious as how acknowledging that the colonial history of photography and how it has contributed to shape and reduce our understanding and the way we understand Black emotional interiority and Blackness, how performance and self-portraiture in your practice has helped you challenge or create a different narrative. So yeah.
For me, I think a lot of it comes from my own experience as a viewer, and I think about the work that, as I said, unlocks something for me, or the work that makes me feel like, oh, this is real, and I have found most often it's what led me to Nicole Fleetwood's text in the first place, because I found, straight documentary images, photojournalistic images, are images that have too easily been weaponized into a form of fixed truth. And performance from the jump is this is not a fixed truth, right? A performance is open to interpretation, right? A performance is a version of something. And I think it's that openness that somehow in the end produces something that feels emotionally true to me. And in my own response to that, I was like, that's what to me, I wonder, if that's how these other works make me feel, then it made sense for me that that's the work that's the strategy that I want to bring into my own work. And then, Nicole Fleetwood and there's other performance study scholars that I have read that speak about that sort of triangular relationship between affect and performance and visuality, and just the affective response that we have to performance. Because it's like what we feel affects what we see. Yeah, so it turns up the volume on what we feel.
Thank you.
Diana, do you have any questions online?
No, but I will zoom back in and show my lovely face again. Hello again. So it's been some time, Michèle, since we've talked about grief and the relationship to this notion of nonchalance. And I'm wondering, can you speak to that? How does that evolution or that shift from this one place and this notion of nonchalance, or the shift from an outward expression of anything? How did you get to this place? Is it more out of a sense of inner healing and you move beyond this need to produce a particular type of image, or is this developing a skill set for future use? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think a bit of both. I think, I had a really, as you and people who know me, I had a very, very difficult grief experience, and there has been progress personally for me with that in terms of how that manifests, in my daily life and my mental health. But I think it has more to do with, it's less about being nonchalant about grief. It's more about, even with suck teeth, I thought that I was making suck teeth for like an internal experience, and it wasn't until I made it that I realized, oh, you're explaining something to an external audience, and I think it's trying to figure out how, I don't use the word resistance anymore. For me, resistance centers power and foregrounds power, and there's no liberation for me in that. So, these words, unbothered, nonchalant, they're all ways of trying to find a different way, a different framework, a different lens for myself to understand what it is to be an artist making work, hopefully more primarily for my communities, but that is part of a system that is colonial, that the gallery space, the dynamics of the gallery audience, like all of these things are real, and so finding a way, I'm really interested in pleasure. I've been thinking a lot about pleasure versus joy, and how pleasure is something that, we take pleasure in positive things, but we take pleasure in negative things. If somebody you don't like, something bad happens to them, you can feel pleasure about that. There's pettiness in pleasure. And it's these complexities that I feel just on a daily basis, living as a Black queer person in a white supremacist world, where there is just this grief all the time, but it's not just that, right? And so the way that, Namwali Sarpel talks about performing, not reacting to, but performing a non-reaction. So it's like, how do I continue to explore these themes of grief, explore these themes of vulnerability, but not in a way that is about resisting white supremacy, like capital R, capital W, capital S.
Is there a distinction between resisting and refusal?
Well, this is what I'm saying. This is what I'm working my way through all of these things.
Yeah.
And it's like, it maybe in the end, it comes down to just semantics, but semantics is what we have. And so for me, right now, what feels more, these words feel more comfortable to me. They resonate more to me than a word like resistance or a word like refusal. And maybe on paper, it could very much be the same thing. And that's why I started by saying, like, I'm in between, I'm literally thinking these things through right now. And I'm very interested in thinking, thinking in public, right? and seeing what it's, how I make sense of it, even as I articulate it out loud,
Right.
how it lands to people. I'm just really at the beginning of yeah.
In a Canadian context or global? Does it matter to you? Have you noticed?
I get myself in trouble here.
Don't get in trouble. I ain't got no money. I got no money to bail nobody out. I'm just saying.
I mean, I would have to, yeah, I mean, I would have to say in a Canadian context, right? It's where I live and work. I think just those words, I mean, I've been living here for so long, I still really grapple like what that means, because I was 19 when I left Trinidad, and my sense of myself as a Black person, I still find so really fundamentally different to most Black people that are my colleagues, my friends. So the host of privileges that intersect with my Blackness, so all of those things, it's like this foot in between the Caribbean, the Canadian. So much of what I read is African American, so I don't know what to call that context, really.
Yeah. I think that conundrum is the Black Canadian experience, perhaps.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. I had another thought, but it went that way. It flew out the window. Oh no, I was thinking. Oh, I know what it was. Is just talking about this notion of opacity. And thinking, the word that comes to mind for me is game face, right? And thinking of it really specifically in a Canadian context, predominantly white audiences, and feeling that that's something that's necessary to navigate these spaces, and wondering if that's part of this as well.
No, because I'm just tired, right? So
Yeah.
this is what it is, a game face. It's like, oh, there's work to put that on,
Yeah.
And when Fred is like, I'm not bothered, I'm like, that's how I want to feel. I'm like, I want to do what I'm doing, but I'm like, I want to just be like unbothered, I don't want to be putting energy into thinking about how I have to resist, how my artwork has to do, I mean, sometimes I walk into an exhibition and I see the didactic text on a wall, and I see what is being claimed that this work is doing, and I'm like, that's a big ask for a photograph, That's a lot of weight to place on a video, and I'm not trying to do that, so as I said, I don't know if any of this is making sense to anybody, but I just really wanted to use this opportunity, as I said, to think in public and to begin to share, this shift and this in between, and also, as I said, it's part of one of the threads of my practice to try to be transparent about my process, because as somebody who went back to school later in life, I felt so naive so many times in the classroom, to be like, oh, I didn't know that, and then I would think, well, why didn't I know that? Why would I believe something else to be true? It's, as I said, the gatekeeping, the myth making, the who's a genius, who's not, like all of these things, and they're so damaging to those of us who come from other communities who don't have access to certain things. And it's why I use the word permission so much, because, it's other artists who give me permission. It's like we have to give ourselves permission to do so much, because so much is denied us. So I try to be transparent about just the process. And this is where I'm at right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any questions from the space? Somebody here? Okay. Diana, do you have any other questions online from people on Zoom?
No, sir, I do not.
So I think we're going to wrap it up for today. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for all your questions.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Michelle, thank you so much for coming into Fourth Space. And Diana, thanks for being in the virtual space. All of you who are here behind me, there are actually hordes of people in here. And those of you online, we appreciate you making the time and to come in and listen and participate in this conversation. So folks, we're going to close up the online space now. I'm reminding you that it's already available on our YouTube channel. If you want to go to Concordia University's Fourth Space channel on YouTube, Am I just saying the same thing twice? This recording is already there for you to rewatch, share with colleagues, etc. Until next time, bye everyone.